policy and development. Our collective climate future is certainly going to be shaped by the choices that are going to be made by the majority of the world's population that live in the developing world. Yet the global climate policy conversation at the national level, at the international level, doesn't always address the concerns of those that live in the global south and ask how they might align development with low carbon and resilient futures. So this event is all about putting the choices of developing countries and the people that live in the global south at the center of the debate. It will examine different forms of national climate politics, how they intersect with development futures, and it will explore whether and how development choices can indeed internalize climate concerns. That's the agenda for today. Certainly an ambitious and big agenda, but we are blessed with an amazing speaker and an amazing discussant here tonight. Let me briefly introduce the speakers for this event. Our main speaker is Navroz Dubash, who is Professor of Public and International Affairs and High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University. He's also visiting senior fellow at the Sustainable Futures Collaborative in New Delhi, which he helped co-found. Navroz's work examines national and global climate governance. He's interested in the political economy of energy transitions and broader questions of environmental policy. He's currently serving as the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Climate Policy. Many of you here in the room, I can see, have published in that journal. It's one of the leading journals in the field. He's also on the steering group of the UNEP emissions gap report, and he's been an author on reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's a much sought after expert on advisory committees of various governments and international bodies. And it's well worth noting, though without any intention to indicate his advanced age, that he has been engaged in virtually all the climate negotiations going right back to the late 1980s. In fact, Navroz was critical in establishing the Climate Action Network that played such a critical role in the early days of the climate negotiations to inject an NGO perspective. Navroz, thank you very much for being here with us. I would like then to introduce our discussant tonight, Kasia Paprocki. Kasia is Associate Professor of Environment in the Department of Geography and Environment here at LSE. She directs the Environment and Development Program in the department. Her own research is very much focused on the politics of climate change adaptation, with a very distinctive focus on adaptation in developing countries. Her book that won many awards is on Southeast Asia, and she addresses broader concerns of the political economies and ecologies of development. It's well worth noting that Kasia has received many awards for her research, and only last year she won a Philip Lieberhum Prize in Geography, which I think is a very fine achievement. Congratulations, Kasia. Just briefly on the event tonight and how we'll run it. So I will now invite our main speaker to give his lecture, which will run for about 45 minutes. After that, Kasia will speak for about 5 to 10 minutes in response, and we'll give the main speaker a chance to respond to that. And after that, I will invite you all to join us with questions and comments. Could you please get ready to raise your hand, and when I give you a chance to speak, the microphone will be passed around. Wait for that, please. Just tell us who you are and perhaps what program you're in at the LSE, and I will then take a few questions in blocks so that we can get through them all. I should mention the event is being recorded, so should all go well on the technological side, we will produce a podcast of this event at a later stage. And finally, before we get started, could you please put your phones on silent? I used to say switch them off, but you're allowed to go on X or Blue Sky or wherever you are to comment on the event, but that's entirely up to you. Put them on silent, please. So, without much further ado, please join me in welcoming our main speaker tonight, Navroz Dubash. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Faulkner, and thank you to the Department of International Relations, the Global School of Sustainability here at LSE. I'm really, really delighted to be here. Very much look forward to the conversation. What I want to do with my time today is try and do two things, really. I'm going to talk, the title here of this talk is Decentering Emissions, and it's deliberately meant to be a little bit provocative, because if we're talking about climate change, why would we want to decenter emissions? So I want to sort of convince you that decentering emissions is a way to actually take seriously the concerns of the developing world and actually engage the developing world much more deeply in this conversation than has been the case so far. The other thing I want to try and do is speak to the current moment. And the problem with doing that, of course, is the current moment is, it's closer in the rearview mirror than you think. I mean, every time you think you have something to say about what's going on, it changes yet again. But I'd like to try and engage with it. And I think this is a challenge for all of us in academia. All our old lectures really kind of don't seem to make sense in the current context. So I'm trying to sort of be a little bit contemporary and try and engage with what's going on right now. You can be the judge of whether I have any success in doing that at all. Okay, so what I will do today is really can be divided into four broad themes. First, I want to explain why I think we should focus on the developing world. I don't think this audience needs much guidance on that, but I think we all have implicit priors as to why this is important, and I want to make mine explicit. Then talk about why I think we need to decenter emissions. And introduce this idea of climate-facing developmentalism or climate developmentalism as a way of talking and thinking about the climate debate. And then taking a page out of Mark Carney's speech yesterday, if some of you may have read about it, he basically says we are at a moment of global rupture, which I think is right. And in that context, what does it mean for climate and what I'm calling the climate narrative wars, right? How do we actually rescue climate change in this context? So those are the four things I'm going to try and do. Very simply, why focus on the developing world? That's where most of the people today are, and we need to understand what sorts of concerns and issues we bring to the table, speaking as somebody who spent most of the last couple of decades in India. So we focus on the developing world because if we are to address climate change, the things we need to do to address climate change have to be politically saleable to the billions of people sitting in the developing world, right? So that's the starting point. I'm going to skip one slide and move to this one. How do we think about what it is that the developing world needs to do? And I'm going to take advantage here of a somewhat complicated IPCC figure. And all IPCC figures, as those of you who've engaged or read these documents know, are horrendously complex. This is one of the simpler ones. And what it does is it tells us about global emissions per capita here on the y-axis, right, against development level as measured by the Human Development Index. And what's interesting about this, and the size, I should say, the size of each bubble is the total size of emissions of that region of the world. What's interesting about this, of course, is that it doesn't cluster neatly. It's sort of spread out. And you have a bunch of very poor countries down here with low levels of emission and low levels of development. You have some in the middle, and you have some all the way up to the top right. And where we all need to go is down here in what is labeled the Sustainable Development Corridor, right? High levels of emission, high levels of development, low levels of emissions. That means that countries in South Asia and Africa have to move horizontally in this figure. East Asia has to move diagonally, and much of the industrialized world has to move vertically down, right? Now, in the normal course of events, you would expect countries to follow this trajectory, just steadily rising, going up to where sort of Australia, New Zealand, the US, and so on are. What that would mean is steadily rising energy, and it would mean steadily rising emissions. So now we have to achieve the same levels of energy, but with lower emissions. That should be straightforward, right? Because after all, renewable energy is cheap. Not necessarily. And the reason I think I'm pausing on this diagram is to try and give a sense of how difficult this trajectory might be for many countries, for 5 or 6 reasons that I've got on the other side of the slide there. The first is all of these countries have to increase energy, and I'm focusing in particular on the poorest countries here, have to increase energy use while decarbonizing, right? And they have to do it at a level of energy use that is really, really low, right at the floor, sort of, maybe 10 or 20 gigajoules per person versus 100 or 200 for developing countries. They have to do this in ways, and these transitions are capital intensive. Renewable energy is very capital intensive, and these are all capital scarce countries. They need to do it while impacts are growing, and they need to do it in the context of very weak state capacity. So all of this is an enormous challenge. And moreover, let's not forget that if we think about who needs to bear the cost of adjustment, there is a larger context here which is encapsulated in this debate over climate equity, which essentially says which parts of the world cause the problem more than others, and it is the parts that are highlighted in red over here, right? So this is the nature of the problem. The nature of the problem, as I see it, is that the case for why and how developing countries should engage climate change has not really been very convincing. Yes, developing countries bear the populations that are the most vulnerable, but they didn't cause the problem. And the cost of adjustment has to happen at a time when developing challenges are considerable, which is why we've ended up in sort of deadlocked climate negotiations. How do we move past this? And here's the case I'm trying to make about why I think decentering emissions might work. And this is sort of you maybe have seen this slide before. This gets circulated a lot. So it's somebody like me standing up there giving a talk about climate change, and somebody says, look, what if it's a big hoax and we do all these great things for nothing, right? And that's kind of the underlying message. The point of decentering emissions is to make space for framing climate approaches around all these other things we want to do anyway. Sustainable cities, better public transport, cleaner air, etc. And figure out how to do that in ways that speak to local politics, right? So that's really the message of this section. I want to start, though, with how we normally talk about climate change, right? How we normally talk about it is as a global collective action problem with a focus on emissions. And how does this work? We start by meeting in a big meeting room here. These are climate negotiations. There are people standing outside. This is a sign from Copenhagen. There's no planet B. You end up with negotiated text that says, let's limit emissions to well below 2 degrees, aspiring for 1.5 degrees. There's also talk of adaptation and finance and so on. And you end up with a set of objectives that are all articulated in terms of emissions. So this is a very well-known emissions gap figure, which says, look, the top lines are where emissions are, these bottom lines are where we need to go, the gap between them, the emissions gap, which is actually very large, all those orange and red lines, is where we actually need to end up, right? And academic writing has focused on this sort of framing as well, and I'm going to sort of just quickly mention some of Robert's early work actually around the time of the Paris Agreement. The kinds of conversations and the kind of writing we had at the time was, can the Paris Agreement lead to a process where countries, through soft reciprocity mechanisms, seeing that each other are doing, raising their ambition and coming up with more targets, that we can actually leverage each other upward? That's sort of that was some of the earlier thinking around Paris. Others, and I'm thinking here of Cohen and Oppenheimer, said, well, actually it's more of a two-level game, because what countries put on the table in terms of their emissions reduction depends on what they can sell politically at home, right? So you have to look at both of those things together. And that leads me to the other way of looking at this problem. So this is sort of the top-down construct, but there is also a bottom-up construct, right? Which says that climate change and climate change politics is embedded in all sorts of national politics and policy that might be about typhoons, drought, it might be about the Ukraine war, it might be about air quality, right? And so when countries put together their national plans and policies, they don't just do it as an outcome of what they've pledged. That's actually a bottom-up process that is mediated by all kinds of national factors, the kinds of narratives that countries tell each other, or that groups within countries tell each other, the extent of political mobilization, the policy frameworks, the institutions, and so on and so forth, right? And so the writing around this, so I tried to write around this a little bit a few years ago, basically making the argument that the ways in which these national pledges, the national plans and policies, the ways in which they are understood is deeply inflected by the particular politics of a country. And more recently, there have been a couple of really very solid and very interesting papers. Title of one says that we have been prisoners of the wrong dilemma, which basically says, actually, if you look at when countries move their politics on climate change, it's not when something changes internationally, it's when something changes domestically. When there is a domestic redistributive outcome where, for example, a renewable energy industry gets an upper hand over, say, fossil fuel industry, right? Where there's some groups that are in favor that manage to wrest political power, right? So, of course, in practice, both of these things are true, right? So this is my effort to kind of summarize how I see the climate arena. And it's, in a sense, the national plans and policies that countries put in place are driven bottom-up by all these things, but then they also go through this process of review at the international level, and that, in a sense, is what the Paris Agreement really is about. So this is my diagram to tell a story about the Paris Agreement, right? So you start with sort of an objective. There's capacity and finance support. Countries put together nationally determined contributions. There's reporting of progress, and then there's a stock take every 5 years. This is sort of the Paris cycle. The reason I've gone through this sort of long narrative here is to convince you that while conventionally many of us think of this top half as being the core of global climate politics, I think the core of global climate politics is actually down here. It is in countries after countries figuring out how they can make their own politics at home lead to politically saleable outcomes that give both development as well as climate change outcomes. And that's really been the focus of my work, which is not to say, again, the international side isn't important, but the motive power, the driver, is really at the national level. Right? So that's really the point I want to make, that this is sort of the mental construct that I'm bringing to the climate conversation. And the reason then to think about decentering emissions is that when you talk about this transition from here to here, from all these sort of newsworthy events up to national plans, they're going to be driven by things that are not denominated in emissions terms. And I'll just give you a small anecdote here. I was part of various government processes in India around the time of the Glasgow climate meetings. And we had just a parade of UK diplomats coming through saying, when is India going to come up with a net zero target, right? And it was like, various people came, ministers and academics and so on and so forth. And eventually India went ahead and agreed to a net zero target of net zero by 2070. But really, nothing on the ground changed, because it was very hard to imagine what a net zero by 2070 target 50 years in the future at the time, right? And for those of us old enough for this to make sense, that's as far in the future as 1970 was in the past, right? And if you think of what the world was like in 1970, hard to imagine where we are today. Similarly, what is 2070 going to look like? What does that mean for various development aspirations? What does an abstract target mean, right? And that was sort of a moment when I really felt like we had to be focusing on domestic politics in this sort of way. So it led me to do a bunch of work in India and on India, which I'm going to take you through quickly now. And I'm going to look at these 4 areas. So electricity transition, resilience, state capacity, and then tie it back up to the global story. Right? And the point of all of this, of course, is to say there is a way of talking about climate change that places development front and center. And what might that look like? I should say, this doesn't mean that India has cracked this or solved it, but it tells us the kinds of questions we need to be asking. Okay, so let's start with electricity transition. India has actually done really quite well. We've had this rapid growth in renewable energy from 2015-16 to 23-24. It's actually a 40% growth, and you can see that the gray share, which is coal, has shrunk in terms of the capacity to produce electricity from renewable energy. But at the same time, the actual amount of coal in our electricity system has remained the same, about 75%. Right? And the reason for this is that energy demand is growing so fast that it's absorbing both the coal and the renewables. How might this change? How might India actually start reducing its coal? Well, there's a number of political constraints to doing that. And the challenging thing is these political constraints are really interwoven with India's politics and economics. So concern number one is actually jobs. And this is true in, of course, much of the developing world. So one of the things that the government of India has done, like many other countries, is put in place industrial policies to try and promote manufacturing around renewable energy as well as around electric vehicles and so on and so forth. So this little chart on the right shows all these dots are different policies the government of India has put in place. And just by way of comparison, this is what China has done and this is what the US has done. You notice a cluster pre-Trump and a cluster post-Trump, and not a lot in Trump 1. And this is the effect it's had, right? And China has definitely been the most successful. This is now at the forefront of climate policy. What country after country is doing to try and promote manufacturing and become competitive and job-creating in clean energy sectors. So climate change is increasingly a story around manufacturing and competitiveness in these new sectors, right? This is really important for India because we have about 4 million people dependent on coal, many fewer directly working in it, but then a lot that are around 400,000 directly working and the rest are indirectly dependent. But even if we manage to create new green jobs to replace coal jobs, they'll be in a different part of the country, right? So this regional distribution of jobs is a real issue. What's another problem? Another problem is who's supporting this transition to green, right? So there's a whole set of literatures now around the green spiral. If you have industries, renewable energy industries, for example, that see benefit from promotion policies, they'll lobby for more. That will lead to more policies. Therefore, you'll have more renewable energy and so on. Well, in India, what's happened is fossil fuel companies, both public and private sector, have also got into renewable energy. And so you actually have them hedging, right? And so they come out ahead with promotion policies on both sides. So the politics is a bit more complicated than that. And even though manufacturing is where the jobs are, it's so happened that deployment-based companies have ended up being more powerful than manufacturing companies. The third set of issues is around finance, right? So in India, we have this long-standing problem of electricity distribution companies that are essentially bankrupt or in the red, and so they're not good and reliable counterparties for renewable energy companies. So sorting out renewable energy means sorting out this 30 or 40-year-old problem of Indian electricity distribution. Another problem is interest rates. Indian interest rates are around 6% for renewable energy, about double what is there in Europe. And yet another is that Indian banks, largely public sector banks, that were arm-twisted to lend to the coal industry, are heavily exposed. And so India's coal fleet, which is about 12 years old on average, right, and a coal plant can run for 40 or 50 years, if you shut that down prematurely, it has backward pressure to the Indian finance and banking sector. So a renewable energy transition in India isn't just about the cost of renewable energy. Right? Right now, renewable energy is cheaper than coal, but it's about at least all these other things, as well as several more that I haven't really got into. I want to turn to resilience next. Right? There is more and more conversation and discussion around resilience in India and more research. We all know India is deeply vulnerable. And so thinking about how to develop requires us to think about forms of development that are resilient. These two things are going together, and people are beginning to engage this conversation in India. So one recent paper actually had this startling number, which is much higher than other papers, that a 1% annual temperature variation will lead to almost a 4% decline in long-term economic growth in India. So in other words, around 2050, 2060, if India was growing at 6%, it would actually be more like 2%. Right? And this is because of labor effects, but also effects on the efficiency of capital and what ecosystem services will bring. How does a government deal with this? It has implications for the kinds of jobs we create, It has implications for the kinds of industries we think India will be competitive at. It has implications for the natural resources we maintain. All of these are things that put a great deal of strain on the Indian state. Another example is agriculture. Right? So this is another IPCC figure, and all you need to look at is the fact that across a whole bunch of crops, there are these down arrows. So yields are going to go down 2%, 8%, 25%, 5%, depending on the studies, right? They're going to go down. What does that mean? That means that Indian agriculture, which is enmeshed in a complex political economy around food subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, water subsidies, electricity subsidies, particular crops and marketing mechanisms. We have to rethink all those things if we are going to move to more resilient crops, if we are going to deal with the fact that yields are going down, therefore we need to have more acreage under crops. So you have to turn this giant sector, which still employs a huge share of Indians, we have to turn this entire sector in particular directions, right? And that requires research. It requires sort of engagement with agricultural workers, with all the infrastructure I mentioned, and so on and so forth, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is you can't think about development in ways that are innocent of climate change anymore, right? Because we are locking in to patterns that will either be more or less resilient in the same way that we would be locking into patterns that are more or less carbon intensive. So so all of these things are important decisions for the Indian state and the Indian public and the Indian private sector to think about that don't start with emissions. They will end with emissions, but starting with emissions doesn't allow you to think through these things in ways that are useful. I want to just touch on the Indian state here, right? Because this is not to say that the state is the only actor to solve these kinds of issues, but because of the scale and the speed of this and the scope of it, it can't be done without the Indian state. So I see my colleague Anu in the audience here, and she will recognize this diagram because I think she was part of creating it. So this is a map of a diagram rather of how the Indian state has evolved over time, and it has been a process of layering climate responsibilities sequentially on different parts of the state. So the core here is the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. The name climate change was added in 2014. And a bunch of line ministries were given climate responsibilities, right? But the capacity in each of these line ministries is woefully thin. So we filed some right to information petitions, and we found that across all these boxes on this chart, there are 62 people in the government of India, whole or in part, sometimes a quarter of a person, who are tasked with addressing climate change. 62 people, right? Many, many fewer in the states. And that was 2019 or 20 that we filed those, so maybe it's gone up somewhat, but it's still an incredibly small number. I once had a visiting New Zealand, it was an Australian ambassador who focused on climate change, and they had an office tracking different countries, and it turns out that the number of people they had tracking climate change in India was not a whole lot less than the number of people we had working on climate change in the government in India. So, these capacity, it seems strange, but the capacity issues are actually serious, even in a country the size and scale of India. Another problem is India, like other places, has an environment ministry that is understaffed, underfunded, not very, often not taken that seriously compared to, and this is a particularly Indian aphorism, compared to wet ministries being those where a lot of money passes through, right? So in a Minister of Environment or a Secretary of Environment might call a meeting, and people from other ministries will send junior people. They will send people a rank or two down from where they were called to kind of send a signal, right? So in a position with climate change, with this structure, where the Ministry of Environment is at the center, and it's the tail that's supposed to wag the entire dog of the government of India, right? It's very, very hard for it to do it. So is there a chance that there would be some kind of strategic thinking? Well, that's what these organizations were meant to do. Offices in the Prime Minister's office, an executive committee on climate change, they have come and they have gone. They've lasted 2 years or 3 years, but India doesn't actually have this kind of strategic capability. And so part of the work that many, some colleagues and I have done is to think about how India might build a climate-ready state. And I'm not going to go through this slide because I want to focus time on other things. But the point I want to leave you with is that we need this kind of enabling state rather than a regulatory state in India. Not one that is about regulating emissions, but that is about enabling opportunities, searching and implementing opportunities for low carbon and resilient development. And there's a bunch of ideas. If people are interested, we can come back to this. I want to conclude this section, though, by trying to wrap up what I think, actually there's one more slide after this. So what do I think climate-facing development looks like? Right? The objective should be to lock in resilience and lock out high-carbon infrastructure and behaviors. We have to do it by thinking about the political economy. Remember all of that energy transition stuff, right? We have to unlock the political economy, often using these co-benefits, air quality, energy security, sustainable cities, and so on. Things that are tangible to people. We need to do it on a sector-by-sector basis. And what I've shown you here is actually kind of a chart of India's long-term strategy that I was somewhat involved in helping to craft, which is a sector-by-sector development transition story. So this is about reliable, low-carbon electricity systems. This is about transport, and so on and so forth. Right? And I'm going to hammer home the point. Emissions are an unlikely entry point if this is the way in which you're thinking about things. They're a useful point to come out with because we need to have emissions in the conversation, but they're an unlikely starting point. What about the global then? None of this is to say that the global is unimportant. It's just not the center of gravity of this talk. So I've crammed what would really be 3 other talks into this one slide, just to flag that there are a number of other considerations. Right? What do I think is necessary for this sort of climate developmentalism? I think we have to reinforce the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement for at least 3 reasons. One is the procedural requirements of the Paris Agreement. Things like producing a nationally determined contribution, producing transparency reports, producing long-term strategies such as those green boxes I just showed you. These things mobilize bureaucracies and they open the doors to organizations like the one I was part of in India, right? Civil society gets called in the door because suddenly these 62 people in the government in India have to come up with a plan and they need help, right? So it opens those doors. It reinforces the global emissions target and the stock rate process where we're keeping track of how we're doing this. And it keeps climate equity on the agenda because the equity story is about dividing up the pie, which gets forgotten if you're only thinking about these bottom-up actions. But I think increasingly we're going to have to look outside the regime. And there's this academic literature, I'm thinking about Cohen and Victor here, who came up with this term, the regime complex, right? That there are all these other overlapping circles outside the UNFCCC where you have conversations about finance, where you have conversations about sector-by-sector industry transition. And Sable and Victor have recently written about this kind of coordination in the steel sector, in the battery technology sector, and so on and so forth. There's a question about how we diffuse ideas around national laws and governance. And I'm very privileged to be working with Alina here and several others at Grantham on this question, looking at cross-comparative stories. How do we learn about adaptation practices that work across sectors? So there's things to be done at international cooperations in the UNFCCC and through these regime complexes. To pivot a little bit to today, I think we also should be realistic about the fact that we are unlikely to see the kind of cooperation we need in a bunch of other areas, which are just now set up as arenas of geopolitical and geoeconomic contestation. The trade regime, how critical minerals, how countries will nail down access to and supply chains for critical minerals is really going to be a geopolitically and geoeconomically contested issue. I think there's all kinds of interesting and disturbing dynamics around AI. Right? I get the sense that the technology industry in the US is thinking about a future AI technology-led revolution that will, in a sense, provide a backdoor to solving climate change, and they're kind of placing bets on that, including people who actually take climate change very seriously. These are all speculative, but I think these are the kinds of conversations we need to have now. And I think we need to be thinking about doubling down where we can and thinking ahead where things are spiraling a little bit out of control. Okay, so to the last part, what I'm calling these new climate wars, and how do you locate climate developmentalism within it? And I have a subtitle here. This section is stimulated by a recent memo, a recent blog post that Bill Gates put out, which caused me some distress, I will have to confess, and let me explain why that is. Right? To invoke Mark Carney again, I think we are at a moment of global rupture, and we're all flailing to figure out how we talk about climate change at this moment in time. One narrative that, of course, has become very potent because it's backed by this US administration is climate refutation, and I use that term advisedly. I don't think it's climate denial, it's active refutation. I don't think we need to expand on that, we kind of know what that means. The second one is the new kid on the block, really, this idea of climate pragmatism. And it comes out of Mr. Gates' memo, it comes out of statements by the Council on Foreign Relations, a very powerful body in the US. And the kinds of arguments, this is my paraphrase of it, right, is that, okay, climate is serious, but we're getting on top of it. It's not existential anymore. We're pretty much, the temperature targets are less than they were earlier, and so on and so forth. And we should be thinking about health and education first, development first, and climate later. And the key point is, these are separable. Right? Remember that what I told you earlier about resilience. How can you think about Indian agriculture where you separate Indian agricultural development from climate? I don't think you can. This is why I'm disturbed by this. And finally, that you double down on technology, including carbon dioxide removal technology, green technology, and that will be your get-out-of-jail-free card. The third narrative is what I'm trying to, I would suggest, is some version of what I've tried to present today, climate developmentalism, which is kind of the most amorphous, and I think it needs to be brought together. And then the fourth is climate existentialism, which might be a somewhat caricatured version of the global, of the environmental movement, particularly in Europe. Okay? So now I want to take you to a really complicated slide where I try and map this out. And this is the conversation I think we need to be having. For each of these categories, I've come up with a bunch of sort of ways of summarizing what I think they say. So with the science and impact story, you move from, look, climate is not that relevant, technology can handle it, to the fact that it is an existential threat, right? So it's kind of a spectrum there. The perspectives on development, the key distinction is right here between the separation of climate and development and the idea that we have to mainstream climate into development. But I also want to flag, whether wittingly or not, I think the environmental movement, the existential folks, have played into a narrative that says, it's too late for development. We don't have a carbon budget left. So at least it's too late for fossil fuel development. And the instances of that, for example, are Nigerians wanting to develop fossil fuels, and Norway, which is a massive fossil fuel provider, has a huge investment fund on the back of fossil fuels, votes in the World Bank against Nigeria getting a loan for fossil fuel development. Right? It's those kinds of tensions that we've seen in the developing world that lead to that kind of perspective. What about equity? From irrelevant to this kind of view of the carbon budget. The metric of success, I want to focus on this for a second. So it's about growth in the left two boxes. In the climate developmental space, it's about shifting development pathways. Remember that bubble slide at the beginning? It's about shifting and bending pathways in the direction of lower carbon futures and more resilient futures. And for the environmental existentialists, it's really still, I think, a global collective action problem, right? So you end up, therefore, talking about emissions, rather than talking about, if you like, real economic outcomes that are felt and perceived by people. What's the political driver? It's a straight power game here. In the climate developmentalism space, I think it is that prisoners of the wrong dilemma kind of argument that this is about redistributive politics. And interestingly, to me, in the existential story, I think there's a lot of chips have been placed on this idea of climate urgency. if we can just elevate climate urgency, if we can just get climate to be the number 1 or number 2 or number 3 voting issue in country after country, we'll get there. And I personally don't think we'll get there in much of the world. I think we're probably only there in a handful of countries at the moment. So it's not a great political strategy in my view. Right? What about international coordination? I've talked about this. It's unproductive for those who talk about refutation. It's enabling and for the climate developmentalism, and it's determinative. If you take that kind of top-down view, the Paris Agreement as driving as opposed to enabling. Right? There's two ways in which you can look at Paris. What are the kinds of concrete policies? Fossil fuel promotion here, a tech and carbon dioxide removal focus in the second column. Here, this is green industrial policy. You remember all those sort of policies that the government of India had put in place, and mainstreaming resilience. And these are, and in the last column, it's really emissions-denominated policies. Now, of course, this is a caricature, right? The whole point of this is to emphasize differences. But this is the center of gravity within each of these. So all the way over here, and I used to be in the IPCC on the policy chapter, in the 5th assessment report, the entire policy chapter was dominated by discussion of cap and trade and carbon taxes and the carbon border adjustment policy, approach, which of course is a more recent thing. And then the next IPCC, it became conversations about socio-technical transitions, how do you induce electric vehicles, and increasingly the IPCC that's coming up, it's going to be about industrial policy. So there's been sort of a shift in the policy conversation. So what might the mottos be of all of these? Fossil fuel first, lean into technology, no development of innocent of climate change, and a hothouse Earth, to take the title of a paper that came out in Nature a few years ago, right? This existential Dante-like vision of the future. What I want to leave with you with then, and this is the final slide, is I want to just suggest that we are in a moment where engaging in this battle over climate narratives is really, really important. The tension is between taking climate change seriously or not, right? Climate refutation has a lot of power behind it. Climate pragmatism offers an option. And it's a seductive option because it says we're taking it seriously, we're going to be pragmatic, we're going to do what we can now, right? And if we buy, and my suspicion is that there will be an effort to coalesce around climate pragmatism as a counter to this kind of refutation story. And I think that will be quite problematic. It'll be problematic because there's two big differences here. There's no space for equity in the pragmatist approach, and from a material point of view, it argues for separation of development and climate. And so we will lose years and decades where developing countries could be proactively avoiding lock-in to carbon and proactively avoiding lock-in to vulnerable outcomes in areas like agriculture and urban planning, and lose the opportunity to actually build in resilience. If we follow the develop now, climate later kind of model, I think it'll be deeply problematic. And the politics that I am seeing is that the developing world is increasingly saying, you know what, this is taking the pressure off us to answer all these complex questions. We can get back to doing what we always thought we should be doing, which is developing, right? And not worry about climate for now. So the progress we made in advocating for a co-benefits agenda is being unwound. And I can see this in India, right, where the view of separation is getting more and more currency. But in order for the climate developmental view to prevail, we have to deal with the fact that there are dissonances with those who spent their careers working on climate, particularly around whether we start with emissions or whether emissions are the end of that whole process, right? Whether it's part of the loop, but it's not necessarily the starting point. And I see this in the emissions gap report all the time, which is really an emissions-denominated report. How much we politically bank on climate emergency versus domestic, finding ways of country by country building coalitions, and how we think about international cooperation, whether it's supporting and enabling, or whether it is the driver where we get ever more ambitious targets and timetables, and whether the goal is to hold countries' feet to the fire, which is how the sort of existential story would run. And I think that if these two columns, which actually take climate seriously, are not on the same page, the risk is we'll end up in a climate pragmatist world. So I guess this is sort of a plea for common cause around something akin to a climate developmentalist approach. Because that's where all the people are, that's where the potential for political organizing is, that's where the scope for a coherent message that actually has political impact lies. But we have to be clear on what are the friction points and how do we actually find ways of overcoming them so that we don't end up in a world of either climate refutation or climate pragmatism. So that's really all I had. This is a poster that my colleagues gave me on my 50th birthday. I look at it frequently, and I commend it all to you. I think it's not a bad way of approaching the world as we find it today. Thanks very much.
Navroz, thank you so much. Yes, I want that too, please. Good. I'll hand over the mic. Metaphorically speaking, you have your own mic to Kasia. So we look forward to your discussions, comments.
Thank you. And such an honor to get to be in dialogue with you and to comment on this really brilliant lecture you just shared with us. So thank you so much. It feels really generative to me and also provocative, and there's a lot I agree with. And I want to just kind of push on some specific aspects of it that really resonate with my own work and that I think I think could go multiple ways, basically, in this sort of perspective that you've given us on what climate developmentalism looks like. So, I mean, to my mind, that table that you gave us of all of these different versions of sort of approaches to climate politics, that in some sense, all of those different versions of climate politics are, in a sense, focused on thinking about questions about emissions. And, you know, I thought that this very provocative claim that you made about decentering emissions was really important. I also thought that the way that you gave us that sort of diagram at the beginning about top-down versus bottom-up politics was absolutely spot on, because it tells us that most of the sort of global or planetary conversations about how to think about climate politics are really focused on these national level ambitions and the way that they're negotiated at the planetary scale, but that in fact that's not how climate ambitions are pursued. And you know, I think that it is absolutely the case that both mitigation and adaptation strategies are fundamentally more focused than they should be on centering decarbonization as the end game of like everything that we're trying to pursue. And I want to sort of just throw out two examples that I've been thinking about in a paper I'm just about to publish. So mitigation strategies, there's just an almost unlimited amount of critical social science material on how all sorts of carbon reduction strategies have been antithetical to the rights of people where they have been focused. So when we think about carbon trading, the implications to people whose rights to their land and forests has been lost. These are strategies that seek to quantify decarbonization at the expense of the sort of rights of peoples who use the environments within which we're going to do that. And in the global north, the same has also been the case. So, for example, carbon capture and storage, which is a sort of centerpiece of decarbonization strategy in the United States. Of course, just as you described, these sort of domestic politics shift. The IRA, that Biden's sort of champion, the sort of great climate policy produced under the Biden administration, the only piece of it that now has been sort of preserved by the Trump administration, caused this huge boom in sort of a build out of carbon capture and storage facilities, especially in the US Gulf Coast. And the result of that has been the build out of new fossil fuel plants, new chemical plants built primarily in sort of Cancer Alley at the great risk to Black communities who live in that sort of new chemicals corridor, and actually new carbon emissions, right? Like even if they are 90% effective, which is remains to be seen, carbon capture and storage as a way of thinking about how we decarbonize has been come at great risk to local communities, and it hasn't, it is unlikely to win even on its own terms. I think that on the adaptation side, we actually see the same thing, and this is something that, I think is potentially implicit in what you've said, but is something that I feel critical about in terms of thinking about the sort of distribution of the carbon budget and the distribution of adaptation finance as a way of thinking only about that sort of first map that you showed us, where the equity concerns are related to who has emitted the most carbon, and therefore who's vulnerable. And to my mind, thinking about this inequitable distribution of historic carbon emissions is itself also a limited way of thinking about equity. So I had a conversation once with I think about this conversation every day, with a friend who was sort of a leader in the loss and damage policy space. And I said, you are thinking about the loss and damage of climate change, making this case as a way of saying, these are the damages that people in developing countries will experience because of climate change, and this is why we need to redistribute these funds. And I said, you and I both know that most of these impacts are not primarily the result of carbon emissions. They're the result of the legacies of colonialism, of histories of inequitable development, and all of these things make people more vulnerable to climate change. He was like, I agree with you. That's all true, but we're not going to win that case in this sort of, in these planetary negotiations. And once we get the money, we can do whatever we want with it. And I think that this idea of, once we get the money, we can do whatever we want with it is really similar to this point that you made about thinking about the things we want to do anyway as what we should do with our sort of climate ambitions. But I think the problem with that is that the things we want to do anyway is a very deeply normative question. And it's a question that is specifically unequal within countries. And so your point then about the need for domestic redistributive politics is actually not something that's being achieved through, I think, most expenditure of adaptation finance in India, in Bangladesh, where I work, or most countries in the global south. And so, then the question of how should that finance be redistributed is a question that I think needs to be centered in the conversation then about what should these politics look like. So, lastly, I want to say that I love the way that you came to this, the point for the Bill Gates blog post. I think that one thing that he said that was really sensible was he wrote, sometimes the world acts as if any effort to fight climate change is as worthwhile as any other. And I think that's something that you would agree with. And I also agree with. It's true that the world acts that way, and it is also true that it is not the case. That not all efforts to address climate change are equal, and they will be experienced by different people. The ridiculous thing he said is that more energy use is a key part of prosperity, and so we just need to continue expanding, and we need to, have this sort of techno-optimist belief that innovation will solve all these problems. And so then, he advances proposals like we should develop robotics to remove farmers from farming. We should use AI to explore greater, mineral extraction of critical minerals. We should use carbon capture and storage to expand sort of industrial processes. So I think that all of those things are antithetical to the kind of redistributive politics that you identified in that table. And I think that centering those politics is necessary to thinking about equity when we decenter carbon emissions. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Kasia. Okay, good. The moment has come where I'll open the floor in just a moment, not quite, because I still want to give Navroz a chance to respond very briefly. But do get your questions ready. Raise your hand, and then there will be a microphone going around. Would you like to
just
respond quickly?
Very briefly. Thank you so much, Kasia. I think you sort of picked up a lot and took a lot of it much further than I was able to go, and pushed me to clarify some things. I'll just make 2 points because I really want to hear from the audience. The first is that I guess the approach that the burden of the first part of my talk was to say we need to be actually opening up the spaces for national politics to be the place where visions of a more just and sustainable future that makes sense in a particular country get decided. And they shouldn't be decided at the international level precisely because it ends up with the kinds of things you discussed. Carbon markets and offsets that end up having social effects in forest-dwelling communities and so on and so forth. But then equally, we need to have the ability within countries like India or Brazil or Benin or wherever else it might be to come up with those visions of our collective future that also take into account social equity. It's not just these co-benefits. It is the vision of a better future within these countries, which will differ, right? So that's kind of the objective. So it's a hard reach because it's both lifting some international pressure and creating a context where that conversation can happen within countries. The second part, I guess, is what comes out of that for me is that the starting point to engage the global needs to be those kinds of nationally owned visions. In reality, it's probably going to be more driven by elite consensus because that's the way politics works in most of our countries. Right? Mm-hmm. But right now, there isn't even an elite consensus where there's enough space and voice for larger social justice concerns to be taken into account. But if you can engage the global on the back of that kind of vision, then it's a much more productive conversation. Right? So that's kind of the idea. What I'm concerned about, of course, is that we're seeing that global space being closed down around a vision that's either just fossil fuels or around something that separates development and climate, and I think that would be that would be an even worse outcome.
Indeed. Okay, good. Thank you for that response. Let me now see where I can start in the room. Who would like to ask the first question? I'm going to go right back to the room. And do say who you are and what brings you here.
Thank you so much. Really nice to meet you. I'm Zach, a student of Kasia, doing my PhD in these sort of questions.
Could you hold it
might
a bit
not
closer?
Be on.
Hello?
Yeah, now. Hold it a bit closer, please.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Cool. Sorry about that. I'm a hopeful person, but I want to ask quite a pessimistic question. And I'm specifically interested in, what is emancipatory climate action look like in a world where there's so many people who have become surplus? And what I mean by that, and it's hard not to see the world through this filter anymore, but you know, we witnessed 80,000 people get wiped off the face of the earth in Palestine, and the world, there was a rupture that happened, but the criminals perpetrating this haven't blinked and have got us scot-free. And when human life can matter this little in the broader scheme of things, what's stopping climate action from taking a very nasty turn and becoming very self-preserving and sort of seeing people of the world in developing countries who are emitting more, for example, as surplus? And I'm just curious if you can help me work through these issues and find some hope. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That's not going to be an easy one to answer. Can I ask for any other shows of hands who would like to come in at this front? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Verissa. I'm currently studying BSc History and Politics, but I'm interested to do a master's in IPE. Thank you very much for your talk, and I think I was thinking similarly to you in that what I thought to question was how, like, do you see any possibility or way that various developing countries or communities can band together or have any kind of leverage to convince the sort of heavyweights, sort of like the US and such, where most of this damage is coming from, so to say? Like, you've already mentioned that there are these inequalities, and it is difficult to address, but while these sort of national development plans are definitely vital to, at the very least, mitigate or maintain the survival of communities that may, for example, be prone to flooding or droughts, what, if anything, do you think can be done to really get places like the US and their industries to change their minds?
Great. Excellent question. Thank you very much. Just to echo the 2 points before I hand it over to you, when you think about the Paris Agreement, it was agreed in 2015. 2015, in retrospect, sounds and feels like a really positive year, right? It was the year before 2016 when other stuff happened. That's one way to describe that year. But also, it seemed as if in Paris we had all come together. And there was that kind of, you know, the big holding hands together at the end of the conference. And as if we had finally created that elite consensus. Navroz, you were talking about that. It even existed in Davos, that elite consensus. That's no longer the case. But there was also a sense of mobilization at every level. Grassroots, indigenous people have come together to lobby for that agreement. And it feels like we've lost something quite important here. And I sense that in both the questions, there resonates that sense of a downturn in the global wheel of history when it comes to climate change. So I just want to sharpen the focus there. Where are we in that historical moment, and what's there for hope to be resurrected against all the nastiness that we experience in international relations? Navroz, I think I need to give you the mic.
Okay, well, I'd love to hear what Kasia has to say about this as well. You know, it's very hard, especially talking to younger folks, to sort of argue for holding on to sort of positive visions and to hope. But I think we have to keep trying. And my version of trying is this, right? Which is that when you have the kind of centralization of power and authority, you have a greater likelihood of the sorts of things you described, you know, the wanton killing of millions of people, including young people in the Middle East, right, in Gaza. And I guess in climate, like in other spaces, I think at root, I guess where I see this is a call for more space for national, and then from there, ideally also local self-determination, about the sorts of lives, the sorts of productive and meaningful lives that people want to live, right? And we have to have, and so the decentering emissions story says, the risk is that we are all being asked to look at a multiplicity of lives and contexts through the same lens. And so that makes it less likely. So will it succeed to go down this other road? Maybe, maybe not. But the balance of probability is that it's more likely if we don't make everybody peer through the same microscope. Right? So that's kind of the spirit, I guess, of how I approach this. And in terms of whether countries can and should band together and communities can and should band together, I think that's really the question. We're in a moment here, and this is why I guess I invoked Mark Carney's quite powerful speech yesterday, for those of you who haven't heard it, which was really about the power of collective action at various scales. I mean, of course, this is just elites banding together, as I've said earlier. It's not exactly a call for a populist uprising or anything, but I think there is that sense in which collective engagement is going to be the way in which we approach this moment. I mean, you indeed sharpened the question, Robert, the way you put it. I actually want to come at it slightly differently, though, and I'm recalling a quite provocative piece by the historian Adam Tooze, who's become quite the sort of man about town on the global stage. And he had a reading of Paris. And he said, look, we had Paris. We had a story about 2 degrees and aspirations for 1.5. And we were talking about limiting warming to 1.5 when most people signing that document pretty much knew it was impossible to get to 1.5. We also had a moment where we all collectively agreed to the SDGs, and we haven't made a whole lot of progress. And so there was a sense where we were all collectively telling ourselves a story that didn't have firm foundations. And part of what we're seeing in this political moment is the fact that there's a reckoning for the fact that we didn't have a clear plan, and we were obscuring the fact that the politics were going to make it very hard to achieve both those things, the SDGs as well as the Paris Agreement. And we pretended that we could build those politics, but we really didn't have the base conditions. And so the small glimmer of hope there is to say, well, maybe telling ourselves a false narrative is even worse than having that narrative be exposed, and maybe we have an opportunity to rebuild in a way that's more constructive and more politically, I'm not going to use the word realistic or pragmatic, but where we can build a politics that's appropriate to the moment.
Kasia, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this point about the shift to thinking about national and ideally local self-determination is also the way that I would think about this question. I mean, to my mind, the collapse of what one might call an elite consensus is a problem primarily if you place all of your hope in the political potential of elite consensus. But if you place your political hope elsewhere, then that collapse is less discouraging. And so, social movements, the way that Navroz was describing in his sort of top-up way of thinking about climate politics, they have really different visions of what a hopeful climate future looks like than, Bill Gates's robotics replacing farmers. They think about things like land redistribution. And land redistribution is not something that's pursued through elite consensus. It's pursued through, collectives of people mobilizing and demanding a different kind of future. So I agree that it's a bleak state of global politics, but that, you know, that has never caused people who are demanding and achieving change to get that change.
Very good indeed. All right. I'd like to take another round of questions. Let's start in the front this time. And over there.
Thank you. My name is Carola. I'm a LSE graduate. I studied international relations and Chinese here for my undergrad. And I wanted to continue maybe on the theme of global. We've talked a lot about the national aspect and the bottom-up approach, which I think is fascinating, and thank you. That was a great perspective. In that light, I'd like to know if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more on how you envision the future of the global looking like. So what do you think is ideally, I guess, going to be the role of international governance, especially in the bleak climate we've been talking about, in the view of, you know, COP30 having fairly disappointing results in many people's eyes, and countries like the US and even China the US, you know, we all know what's going on, but even major emitters like China having very low climate ambitions, at least in what they've declared. So yeah, I'd like to know what your ideal is for what that influence from the top down might look like.
Great, thank you for that. Could you pass it to the middle? Oh, Joanna has it.
Good. Is it on? Yes. So my name is Joanna Setzer, and I'm Associate Professor at the Grantham Research Institute. Thank you so much for the lecture and for the comments so far. My question goes to one of your slides, the one with the cartoon. And so the cartoon said something like, what if we're making the world a better place, but this is all a hoax, right? And so holding to that, so much could result in a better world in these climate policies. But if we look historically, developing countries had, and probably still many have, difficulties embracing the discourse of climate change. So that kind of combined benefits, so on your co-benefits, the environmental benefits combined with climate ones have worked pretty well. And then I'm saying this without being kind of thinking of any specific publication that have said it, but the rich countries have embarked very much into climate for many decades, policies, discourses, and now we are in a moment where so many of these policies are falling apart. So my question first is whether, if this is true, that there are co-benefits that could be done without making policies explicitly climate, if it is the case that we would be going into that phase now. And secondly, if you can give examples of how you see policies that would happily combine these benefits between climate and other environmental social benefits.
Great. Let me take these two. I'll do another round in a moment. And if I may, as chair, just add that dimension to the important question about the global context. Perhaps, Navroz, can you talk a little bit also about how important that global context is for how developing countries like India develop their own developmentalist, climate and developmentalist narrative, strategy and approach? Because if we are indeed losing that global context, because people are now basing their climate policies primarily on the national level, so what's left for the global context and how important is it that we keep coming back at it in order to remind people of the global goal, not just the national narrative? Sorry, I've added to a very good question already, but perhaps you could speak.
No,
to
these are great questions, and one of the challenges I often face, and one reason I think I did that very complex table in my own head, is that I end up in a place where I'm advocating complicated arguments, and complicated arguments get crowded out by simple arguments, right? And so that's why you see a climate existential argument being so easy to understand, whereas this kind of weaving a line in climate developmentalism and what exactly are co-benefits and how do you, it's much harder to get motivated by it and get your head around it. But I think we have to embrace that complexity, and that's how I'm going to come back to your question. And I'm going to start by pushing back a little bit. and I wrote a piece actually on this, China's NDC was not unambitious. It was called unambitious because it didn't match up to what modelers thought China should do. But what modelers thought China should do was based on a set of assumptions about how much China was responsible compared to every other country. So it was based on a set of normative assumptions about how you divide up the carbon pie. The unambitious version of China's NDC, right, if they achieve what they said they would do, 7 to 10% reductions, by 2030 would reduce emissions 3 times as much as the UK's net zero target by 2050, right, to give you a sense, because of the scale of China. But that's not the point. When we try and do this bean counting around emissions, the modelers will give one argument, I'll give another argument compared to the UK. That's not the point. The point is that China's economic interests now lie in rapidly advancing towards a low-carbon future and getting the rest of the developing world also to rapidly advance, because that's how they'll get markets, right? Their interests are now lined up. That is so moving to the material world of what are the incentive structures for global economics and politics is the question we have to be asking ourselves. And how do we make those things line up more and more, right? So that's how and so then the question becomes global cooperation for what and how. So again, the question gets posed in academic and other circles, will China be a leader? Leadership in that Paris Agreement context is understood as standing up and taking the mic and proclaiming how important climate is and hectoring everybody else to come up with more ambitious pledges, right? But actually going home and saying we're lining up our economy in favor of EVs and batteries and so on, that's actually what leadership needs to be and is. And similarly for global cooperation, I think we have to be looking for global cooperation that makes it ever more likely that countries and companies that want to move in that direction get the support that they need to do so, right? So an example of a concrete mechanism is, will you start seeing the green steel sector coordinating across countries in ways where no single company is out ahead in terms of the amount of risk capital they have to put out there? And can that be supported by some sort of collective government action or through seed funds or whatever else it might be, right? So there's a tangible mechanisms of coordination around those transitions, and I think there's lots of scope to do that. So that's the answer on the global cooperation. Sorry, it was a long answer, but to get to Joanna's point about co-benefits, there's really a question about whether one is kind of overstating this, and I prefer to move from kind of a co-benefits metaphor to what I sometimes call co-benefits on rails, which is it's not about a static decision, it's about a decision over time. So if you look at cities, for example, one of the most important things you can do is urban planning, where people have to commute less. So it's not just buses, it's not just EVs, it's actually designing your cities so the mobility needs are lower, right? By having working spaces next to residential spaces. And that locks you into a low carbon vision of the future that also brings social benefits, it also brings gender benefits, people might be closer to their kids for emergencies and so on and so forth, right? So it's those kinds of things that we have to look for systematically. And my state map kind of thing was really aimed at saying, how do we build the governance structures that incentivize looking for those things? So another example might be a very interesting example around agricultural crop choice. It turns out that millets are much more resilient than green revolution varieties of rice and wheat to variations in rainfall. Millets also give you micronutrients that are much healthier, right? So you have food security implications and health implications tied to a crop choice. But in India, we are locked into a whole industry of fertilizer subsidies and marketing systems and producer prices that lock us into a wheat-rice cropping cycle. So it's those kinds of developmental questions that also have social gains that we need to start unpackaging. And we can't look at the economy as a whole, which is why I like the sector-by-sector story. How does that look in buildings? How does that look in urban? How does that look in transport? How does that look in agriculture? And so on and so forth. Right?
Great, thank you. Do you want to answer that? No. Then I'll take a round. I think I may have to take 3 this time. I see 4 hands. Let's start at the back, the lady at the back, and then...
Hello, is it on? Yes? My name is Montserrat. I'm not from the LSE. It was an open event, but I work supporting developing countries in the climate negotiations with legal support, because I'm a lawyer, and I also did my research on the COP process, so I've been in those rooms for many years, and it's really interesting to hear the India perspective, of course, because I think if I could draw, I could sketch the face of the Indian lead negotiator, and I remember so many of his interventions. And so I really like the idea of that you're bringing us, the narrative, the climate development narrative to replace maybe others, because I feel that at the moment in the negotiations, countries like India or China, and I like the point that you make about their NDC, because they are emphasizing on the nationally determined nature of their commitments to the international regime, they are framed as climate denial, or, and I think there's something, you mentioned many efforts in India at the domestic level that align with this energy transition, but the international negotiations do not allow, or maybe the team who's there, they don't show themselves as climate ambitious in that sense. So I think this would be a good way to match climate ambition with nationally determined and sovereignty over commitments. So my question to you is, how do you see that being translated in the international negotiations, in their narratives? Do you think India or any other country could achieve that in that space?
All right, thank you.
My name is Matthias Larsen. I'm at the Grantham Research Institute. I was listening to your talk and trying very hard to find something to disagree with to make for a good question. It was difficult, but I think I have something. It's on the time scale, technological maturity on power generation. I'm curious what you'd say to the argument that climate developmentalism is only particularly relevant in this moment in time. Say 10 years ago, renewables were more expensive. It was more clearly a short-term trade-off between the clean and development. Right now, it's approximately at par. Renewables perhaps a bit cheaper. That's why we get this whole distributional struggle tied to co-benefits and so on. Whereas in 10 years, renewables will be so much cheaper that there will be no distributional struggle, and therefore it's only relevant at this point.
Great, and I think I can take just one last question.
Sorry, can I just clarify?
Yes.
Do you mean to say that you think that is in fact the case, or you think that that's what I said?
Both.
Okay.
Okay, the gentleman in the middle.
So my name is Soyi, and I'm currently a second-year student studying IRI at the LSE. First of all, thank you, Professor, for this very brilliant lecture. So my question is, in the past decade, we have seen a trend of increasing securitization of climate. We're framing it as a security issue. We've seen several meetings about climate even in a Security Council. But you mentioned that purely elevating the urgency of this problem is not enough to sort of solve the problem. However, I'm wondering, in an era that the biggest historical emitter has left the international arena about climate negotiations, and there's an increasing trend of climate refutation, as you mentioned. Do you think this could possibly undermine the legitimacy of the domestic transitions that you mentioned? And if so, is it possible that maybe securitization is a potential solution to sort of improve the or like elevating the urgency of the problem is a possible way to solve this problem or like improve the legitimacy of it. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to those whose questions I can't take, but we are slowly running out of time, which is why I'm asking our speakers to give us short, sharp answers to those questions they would like to address.
Do you want to go?
I'll give you my time. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
I would like to hear in particular what you think about a couple of these. So the first question, your question, as I understood it, the first question about, and I appreciate the time you seem to have spent in the negotiations, and my condolences. No, it's actually a fascinating process. As I understood your question, you were basically saying, given all these co-benefits and all these things that countries are actually doing, how do they actually get the credit for it in the international negotiation process, right? Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, there's two things. One is often the people doing those things are different from the negotiators because you don't actually have coordination. Those boxes are boxes. They're not joined by tunnels, right? The second reason is they don't actually, so there was a period where we, at least in India and I think other developing countries, we cared about that. Increasingly, there's a sense that we don't really need to care. And even more so when you see countries like the US walking away from Paris. But I think the most important reflection I would say is, I think we are asking for the wrong thing. Why should we be asking developing countries to say, you need to present a good face? Because that gets into an argument that says what's more important than what countries do is what they say. Right? The ambition story is saying, look at what countries say. The implementation story is look at what countries are doing. And so we need to actually be judging the NDCs more by the credibility of implementation plans than the top-line ambition of the pledge. We need to change what we're looking for, would be my answer to your question. I think, I'm not sure, again, I'm not entirely sure where you're going, whether you would sort of disagree with this, but I think that two things. Maybe in a decade, it's true that the gap between renewables and the others will be so much that you won't need the co-benefits argument. But in 10 years, that's a lot of lock-in. That's a lot of lock-in to fossil fuels, right? And that's quite separate from the resilience side, right? That renewable story is a different story from the resilience and the adaptation side. So 10 years of going down the wrong path is incredibly problematic. And I would argue that again, in the spirit of the earlier comment, what we need to be looking for in the developing world is avoided emissions. Why are we not hearing that term more? A lot of the policies are not actually about avoiding lock-in. That's the most important thing that the developing world can do right now, because emissions are going to increase, but they need to increase as slowly as possible with as much political support as possible. So it's a reframing of the conversation. Securitization is a really important question. You know, the part of the U.S. establishment, and there are other people who know the U.S. establishment far, far better than I do in this room, sitting very close to you, as a matter of fact, the part of the U.S. establishment that has always seemed to be clearest about climate change is the U.S. military. And it hasn't stopped them pulling out of the Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC. So I think that it's always been a powerful story, but I don't think it can be something that we rely on as a solution to today's politics.
Wonderful, thank you so much. It pains me to end the conversation. It's been a fascinating evening. It's been hugely enlightening. I'd have to say this was a highlight of the term. We've only just started the term, but this will remain as the highlight of my winter term at LSE. I'd like to thank the audience for coming out tonight, for a wonderful array of questions. You've led the conversation very ably, and please do come and join us at future events, but please join me in thanking our speakers tonight. Navroz,
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you all. Thank you.